The sky over Ethelgard did not possess the gentle blue of Earth's lost atmosphere. Instead, it was a swirling cauldron of bruised purples and electric oranges, torn apart by the constant discharge of ion storms that fed the planet's voracious core. Below this celestial violence, the city sat inside the hollowed skull of a dormant volcano, its towers of black glass and reinforced obsidian reaching up like the jagged teeth of a predator. Inside the grand refectory of High Matriarch Alara, the air smelled of ozone and roasted meat. Plasma chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a cold, flickering radiance over the hundreds of Valkyr nobles who sat at long tables carved from cooled magma. Vanguard Krell stood at the center of the high dais, his presence a physical weight in the room. He was a titan of his species, his skin the color of wet slate, and his long, tapered ears twitching with every vibration of the boisterous hall. He wore only the ceremonial chassis of his Titan core armor, yet the silver filigree etched into the plating glowed with a restless energy. In his massive hand, he held a goblet of fermented star nectar, raising it toward the ceiling as if to toast the storms themselves. And then Krell bellowed, his voice amplified by the acoustic resonance of the obsidian walls. I stepped through the smoke of their burning outpost. The humans, they moved like frightened insects. Their weapons, those primitive projectile hurlers, did little more than scuff the polish on my greaves. I didn't even need to prime my heat blade. I simply walked through them. A wave of guttural laughter erupted from the tables. The Valkyr prized strength above all, and to them, the expansion of the Terran alliance into the fringe sectors was nothing more than a nuisance to be swatted away. They relished these stories. They fed on the narrative of their own invincibility. One of them, a commander by the look of his stripes, actually tried to bar my path, Krell continued, his eyes glittering with a predatory amusement. He stood there with a shaking hand, holding a standard-issue sidearm. I took it from him, not by force, but because he simply forgot how to hold it when I looked him in the eye. I crushed the piece of scrap metal in one hand and his spirit in the other. They are a soft species, Matriarch. They bleed easily and complain loudly. They are not built for the gravity of real war. High Matriarch Alara sat upon her throne of translucent quartz, her posture as rigid as a spear. Her silver hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her long ears were angled sharply forward, catching the rhythmic thumping of fists against the stone tables. She looked at Krell with an expression that was difficult to read, a mixture of royal approval and something deeper, something colder. Beside the matriarch's throne, almost lost in the shadows cast by the massive Valkyr guards, stood Jace Mercer. He was a head shorter than the smallest Valkyr in the room, wearing a plain, matte black diplomatic uniform that lacked any medals or ornaments. His hair was cropped short, showing the silver streaks of premature aging at his temples. He remained perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere on the far wall. Krell noticed him, of course. The vanguard thrived on an audience, and a silent human was the perfect foil for his performance. "Tell me, little liaison," Krell said, his voice dropping to a theatrical rumble as he turned toward Jace. "Was that commander one of your best? Or do you send the cowards to the front lines to ensure they die first?" The hall fell silent. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the city's geothermal stabilizers. Hundreds of pairs of elongated ears swiveled toward Jace, waiting for a flinch, a stutter, or a plea for mercy. Jace Mercer shifted his gaze, meeting Krell's golden eyes with a flat, oceanic calmness. His voice was steady, carrying through the hall without the need for amplification nodes. "The man you are referring to, Vanguard, was likely a member of the civilian security detail at the Sector 7 mining colony," Jace said. Krell let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Civilian? He wore a uniform. He carried a weapon. In my world, that makes him a combatant." Jace tilted his head slightly. "On Earth, we have a saying. If you give a carpenter a hammer, he can build a house. If you give a terrified father a rifle during a shock pod invasion, he is still just a father. He isn't a soldier. He's an obstacle." The tension in the room spiked. A few younger officers stood up, their hands moving instinctively toward the hilts of their sidearms. This was a direct insult to the Vanguard's glory. To suggest that Krell had spent his time killing fathers instead of warriors was to spit on the very foundation of the Valkyr Thiet Luat. You speak as if there is a difference, Krell sneered, stepping down from the dais until he was only 2 meters away from the human. Dead is dead. A victory is a victory. Your people are weak because you waste time categorizing your failures. You should be thanked for the mercy I showed them. I ended their fear quickly. Jace Mercer didn't move. He didn't even blink. I saw the footage from Sector 7, Vanguard. I saw the way the shock pods were aimed at the life support vents of the habitation modules. I saw the way the evacuations were targeted. That wasn't a military engagement. It was a harvest. Krell's face darkened, the bioluminescent veins in his neck throbbing with a dull red light. You dare? You, a representative of a broken remnant, stand in the heart of Ethelgard and accuse me of what? Efficiency? I accuse you of being bored, Jace replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than Krell's roar. I think you've forgotten what it feels like to face someone who isn't afraid of you. I think you've spent so long crushing people who can't fight back that you've started to believe your own lies. The matriarch Alara leaned forward, her ears twitching with a frantic rhythm. Mercer, she said, her voice a warning, you are a guest. Do not overstep the bounds of your station. Jace bowed his head slightly toward the throne, but his eyes never left Krell. My apologies, matriarch, but if the Vanguard is so confident in his assessment of human weakness, perhaps he wouldn't mind a practical demonstration. Krell's laughter was like the grinding of tectonic plates. A demonstration? From you? You're a diplomat, little liaison. You carry a data pad, not a blade. I would break you before the arena's sensors even finish their initial scan. Then it should be a very short educational session for your people, Jace said. I request a formal duel under the law of the kinetic proof. No lethal force, just a test of systems. Your Titan core against my standard-issue kinetic suit. The hall erupted in a chaos of noise. It was a joke. A human, small and fragile, challenging the vanguard of the Valkyr to a kinetic trial. It was like a gnat challenging a hurricane. But the law of the kinetic proof was sacred. If a challenge was issued in the presence of the matriarch, it had to be acknowledged. Krell looked around at his peers, his chest swelling with pride. He saw an opportunity to finally silence the human dissent that had been simmering in the council. He saw a chance for one last grand spectacle before the final annexation of the human sectors. I accept, Krell declared, slamming his fist against his chest plate with a sound that echoed like a thunderclap. At the next solar rise, in the arena of echoes, I will show this little human the difference between a story and a reality. Jace Mercer nodded once, a sharp, professional motion. I'll be there, Vanguard. Try not to be late. I have a lot of reports to finish afterward. As Jace turned and walked out of the hall, his footsteps silent on the obsidian floor, Krell didn't see the way the human's hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, focused fury that had been waiting for 10 years to find its target. The prep chamber beneath the arena of echoes was a cold, circular room carved directly into the basalt foundations of the city. There was no furniture, only a single metal bench and a wall-mounted interface that projected the current atmospheric conditions of the surface. Jace Mercer sat on the bench, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He was performing a mental diagnostic, a habit drilled into him by years of service in the Shadow Six. He wasn't thinking about the duel. He was thinking about a girl named Mia. She had been 6 years old, holding a tattered synthetic doll, when the first Valkyr shock pods had slammed into the red dust of Sector 7. He remembered the sound of the air escaping the Habdome, the high-pitched whistle that sounded like a scream. He remembered Krell, or at least the towering, crimson silhouette of Krell's armor, walking through the breach, his heat blade glowing like a small sun. A soft chime announced a visitor. Jace opened his eyes as the heavy blast door slid open. High Matriarch Alara entered, her long silver robes sweeping the dusty floor. She was alone, which was a breach of protocol that didn't escape Jace's notice. You are a difficult man to understand, Mercer, she said, her ears angled in a way that suggested deep contemplation. Most of your kind seek to avoid the Vanguard. They hide in the shadows of their embassies and pray that our expansion stops at their doorstep. You, however, have jumped directly into the fire. Jace stood up, acknowledging her presence with a stiff nod. Sometimes the fire is the only place where things get clear, matriarch. Ilara walked toward the center of the room, looking up at the holographic display of the arena above. Thousands of Valkyr were already filling the stands, their voices a low, distant roar that vibrated through the stone. You understand that Krell will not be gentle. The law of the kinetic proof requires that the duel continues until one party is incapacitated or surrenders. Krell does not believe in surrender, and his armor is designed to deliver force that your skeletal structure cannot possibly withstand. I've done the math, matriarch, Jace said, reaching for his kinetic suit, which lay folded on the bench. It was a thin, flexible garment made of non-Newtonian fibers and microdampeners. To the Valkyr, it looked like a second skin, providing almost no protection. To Jace, it was a precision tool. It's not about how much force you can take, it's about where you let that force go. Ilara turned to him, her eyes sharp. You spoke of Sector 7, you spoke of the footage. I have seen the same archives. Our records show a fierce engagement against a fortified rebel cell. Jace pulled the suit over his shoulders, the fabric zipping shut with a faint hiss of pressurized air. Your records are based on Krell's telemetry. A Titan core suit is a closed system. It reports what the pilot wants it to report. But an arena is different. Ilara's ears twitched. You chose the Arena of Echoes for a reason. It's the only place on this planet where the truth is hard-coded into the floor, Jace said, his voice cold. The neural mapping system doesn't care about rank or glory. It only cares about vectors, impact, and intent. If I can stay standing for 10 minutes, the system will have enough data to reconstruct the reality of Krell's combat style. And when that data is cross-referenced with the sensor logs from Sector 7, well, the math will finally start to add up. The matriarch remained silent for a long moment. She was a ruler who had maintained her power by knowing when to speak and when to listen. For the first time, she truly looked at the man in front of her. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided he didn't like the ending. You are risking your life for a footnote in a history book, she said quietly. It's not a footnote to the people who were there, Jace replied. He picked up his wrist-mounted interface and snapped it into place. I'm not here to win a fight, matriarch. I'm here to fix a bug in the system. Across the complex, in a chamber 10 times the size, Vanguard Krell was being sealed into his Titan core armor. A team of 6 technicians moved around him with practiced efficiency, bolting heavy tungsten plates over the pulsating heat core. The suit groaned as its internal servos hummed to life, a deep, predatory sound that felt like a beast waking from a long slumber. Status? Krell grunted, his voice distorted by the helmet's external speakers. All systems green. Vanguard, the lead tech said, his voice trembling slightly. Reactor at 98%. Kinetic shields are primed. But sir, the human suit, we've run the scans. It has no offensive capabilities. It's a purely reactive system. Krell snorted, a sound of metallic contempt. It's a shroud. He's dressed himself for his own funeral. He thinks he can outmove me? He thinks he can dance around a Valkyr Vanguard? I've hunted faster things on the plains of Ignis 4. The technician hesitated. Sir, the matriarch has requested that the arena's transparency filters be set to maximum. Every bit of data, every neural spike, will be broadcast to the public networks. Good, Krell said, his massive gauntlets closing into fists that could crush a boulder. Let them see it. Let them see what happens when a gnat tries to stop a landslide. I want the image of his collapse to be the last thing every human in this sector thinks about before they go to sleep tonight. The signal chime echoed through the chambers, 3 long, resonant tones that signaled the opening of the gates. Krell stepped forward, each footfall shaking the floor. He felt invincible. He felt like the embodiment of the Valkyr Thiet Luat. He didn't feel the small, nagging tremor in his left shoulder servo, the result of a decade-old impact from a mining laser that he had officially reported as a destroyed enemy tank. In the other tunnel, Jace Mercer took a final breath, tasting the metallic air of the underground. He closed his eyes and visualized the arena floor, not as a stage for combat, but as a grid of possibilities. He thought about the 300 lives lost at Sector 7. He thought about the weight of their silence. He opened his eyes. They were no longer calm. They were focused, sharp as a surgical blade. "Time to work," he whispered to the empty room. As he stepped out into the blinding light of the arena, the roar of the Valkyr crowd hit him like a physical blow. Thousands of voices screamed for blood, for dominance, for the familiar comfort of a crushing victory. Jace didn't look at them. He looked at the giant in crimson armor standing 30 meters away. Krell raised his arms, soaking in the adulation, his heat blade igniting with a hiss of superheated plasma. The blade was 1.5 meters of pure incandescent death, casting a red glow across the obsidian floor. Jace Mercer didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his fists. He simply stood there, his feet shoulder-width apart, his body relaxed, his hands hanging at his sides. The holographic displays above the arena flickered to life, showing the two combatants. Krell's biometrics were a sea of aggressive reds and oranges, his heart rate elevated, his adrenaline spiking. Jace's biometrics were a flat, steady blue. His heart rate was 62 beats per minute. The crowd's roar faltered. The contrast was too jarring. It wasn't a duel. It looked like an executioner standing before a statue. "Let the kinetic proof be established." The matriarch's voice rang out from the high balcony. The chimes sounded. Krell didn't wait. He didn't believe in feeling out an opponent. He believed in the shock of the first strike. He lunged forward, his armor's thrusters firing in a short, violent burst. He covered the 30 meters in less than 2 seconds, his heat blade swinging in a massive horizontal arc designed to bisect the human where he stood. The crowd leaned forward expecting the spray of red and the smell of ozone. But Jace Mercer wasn't there. He hadn't jumped. He hadn't dived. He had simply stepped, a tiny 3-inch shift of his lead foot and a slight rotation of his hips. The plasma blade passed so close to his chest that it singed the outer layer of his kinetic suit, but it hit nothing but air. Krell's momentum, amplified by the heavy armor, carried him past. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. As the vanguard passed, Jace's hand flicked out. Not a punch, but a light, 2-fingered tap on the back of Krell's left elbow joint. On the massive holographic screens above, a small white dot appeared on the schematic of Krell's armor. A kinetic disruption. A minor error message scrolled across the public display. "Servo alignment fluctuation detected." The crowd was silent. Krell spun around, his movement slightly clumsier than before. "You think you're fast, human? That was luck. I'll peel that suit off you like skin." Jace didn't reply. He just reset his stance, his eyes tracking the red glow of the blade. Luck didn't have anything to do with it, Vanguard, Jace thought, his mind already calculating the next vector. It was just physics. And you've been ignoring physics for a long time. Krell roared and charged again. But this time, he wasn't just swinging. He was hunting. And in the high balcony, Matriarch Alara watched the data streams, her ears lowering in a slow, dawning realization. The human wasn't fighting Krell. He was deconstructing him. The air in the subterranean bunker smelled of ancient dust and the sharp metallic tang of cooling basalt. Jace Mercer sat on the edge of the narrow metal bench, his fingers tracing the seams of his kinetic suit. Every stitch represented 1,000 hours of research by the Terran Alliance's Last Stand initiative, a desperate attempt to turn the human body's fragility into a defensive asset. To the Valkyr, this suit was nothing but a thin layer of fabric, a white flag worn as clothing. They didn't understand the layered weave of carbon nanotubes and non-Newtonian fluids that could harden in a microsecond or flow like water depending on the frequency of the impact. He reached for the small circular device on the floor. It was a maintenance drone, a battered sphere of scratched alloy that the Valkyr had allowed him to keep only because they viewed it as a toy. He tapped a command into his wrist console, and the drone hummed to life, its single optical sensor glowing a soft amber. "Sit, Rep," Jace whispered. The drone's voice was a dry, mechanical rasp. "Atmospheric pressure is currently 3 times Earth standard. Gravity is sitting at 1.4 Gs. Your core temperature is holding at 37 degrees Celsius. However, your heart rate is climbing. You are currently at 72 beats per minute. Keep it steady," Jace said, more to himself than the machine. "We're Oscar Mike in 10 minutes. Are the data links bridged?" The drone rotated its chassis. "The Arena of Echoes uses a standard high-frequency neural broadcast. I have successfully slaved your suit's telemetry to the public projection nodes. The moment you make contact with the Vanguard's Titan core, the crowd will see every vector of force. They will see the ghost, Jace. Good, Jace said. That's the point. The heavy door to the prep chamber hissed open, admitting a slice of the red, chaotic light from the arena corridors. A young Valkyr cadet stood there, his armor unpolished, his long ears twitching with a nervous energy that he was clearly trying to suppress. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Barely a man by human standards, a mere child by his own. He held a ceremonial tray containing a cup of water, the traditional offering given to those about to face the kinetic proof. The cadet approached Jace with a stiff, formal gait. His gaze was fixed on a point just above Jace's head, as if looking directly at the human would somehow contaminate his own sense of superiority. The matriarch sends her regards, the cadet said, his voice cracking slightly. She reminds you that the Arena of Echoes records everything. Your cowardice will be archived for 1,000 years. Jace took the cup, his hand perfectly still. Thanks for the heads up, kid. Is that what they're calling it in the barracks? Cowardice? The cadet's ears flattened against his skull, a sign of genuine agitation. You challenged a Vanguard. You, a meatbag from a dying sector. You're not even a real soldier. You're a suit rat. You think you can dodge the law? Krell is going to turn you into a red smudge on the obsidian, and we're going to cheer while he does it. Jace took a slow sip of the water. It was cold and tasted of minerals. He looked at the cadet, seeing the fear hiding behind the bravado. The boy wasn't angry. He was terrified because Jace didn't fit the narrative. If a human could stand his ground without trembling, then the stories the cadet had been told since birth were lies. And if those were lies, then the universe was a much more dangerous place than he had been led to believe. Tell me, Jace said softly, putting the cup down. Have you ever been to the outer settlements? Sector 7? The mining belts? The cadet scoffed. I don't waste my time on dust balls. I'm stationed in the capital. I protect the heart of the Empire. Right, Jace nodded. You protect the heart. But you should ask Krell why he never brings back prisoners. You should ask him why the footage from the great victories always has the audio scrubbed. You're a liar, the cadet spat, but his heart rate, visible to Jace through the drone's tactical overlay, jumped to 110. Krell is a hero. He's the shield of Ethelgard. He's a man in a very expensive tin can, Jace said, standing up. And today I'm going to show you what's inside. The cadet backed away, his hand hovering over his utility belt. You're dead, human. You're already dead. Jace didn't answer. He turned back to his drone. Gear up. Deploy the subsurface sensors the moment we hit the floor. I want every tremor, every microfracture in that basalt mapped out. Acknowledge, the drone chirped. Moving to standby, Jace closed his eyes for a second, and suddenly he wasn't in the bunker anymore. He was back in the tunnels of Sector 7. The air was thick with the smell of vaporized cooling fluid and the copper scent of blood. He could hear the screams of the families huddled behind the reinforced blast doors that were never meant to stop a Valkyr heat blade. He remembered his commander, Sarah Vance, standing in the corridor with nothing but a flare gun and a wrench. Go, she had screamed at him. Get the kids to the shuttle. I'll buy you 2 minutes. He had given her those 2 minutes. He had listened to her die over the comms while he strapped 3 terrified children into a cargo pod. He had watched the readout of her suit's vitals flatline exactly 120 seconds later. He had been a soldier for 15 years, but in that moment, he had realized that soldier was just a word used to make the slaughter sound like a game. He opened his eyes. The guilt was there, as it always was, a heavy stone in his chest. But beneath the guilt was a cold, hard clarity. He hadn't come to Ethelgard to survive. He had come to be a witness. The signal chime for Chapter 3's conclusion echoed through the room. Jace checked the seal on his wrist-mounted console one last time. The numbers were scrolling in a frantic, luminous green. Heart rate 64, oxygen saturation 99%, kinetic dampeners at full charge. He checked his pocket. There, tucked into a small, reinforced pouch, was the synthetic doll he had found in the ruins of Sector 7. It was charred on one side, its plastic face melted into a permanent, distorted smile. He didn't take it out. He just needed to know it was there. The door groaned open again, and this time, there was no cadet. Only the wide, yawning mouth of the tunnel leading to the arena floor. The roar of the crowd was a physical wall of sound, 100,000 Valkyrs screaming for the ritual to begin. It was a sound of absolute certainty, the sound of a people who believed they were the only ones who mattered in the dark expanse of the stars. Jace stepped into the tunnel. His boots made no sound on the stone. He moved with a deliberate, haunting slowness, a shadow walking into the heart of a sun. "You ready, Jace?" the drone whispered as it hovered just behind his shoulder. Jace didn't look back. "Let's go give them something to remember." He walked out into the light. The Arena of Echoes was a vast, circular pit, 300 meters across, lined with tiered seating that reached up into the hazy volcanic sky. At the center, the floor was a masterpiece of Valkyr engineering, translucent panels of high-impact alloy over a bed of sensors that could detect the footfall of a spider. Krell was already there. He looked like a god of war carved from blood and shadow. His Titan core armor was humming, the heat-sink vents on his back glowing a dull, angry orange. He held his plasma axe in one hand, the head of the weapon crackling with 1,000 degrees of restrained energy. The crowd saw Jace and the laughter began. It started in the lower tiers and rippled upward, a mocking, jagged sound that filled the crater. They saw his matte black suit, his lack of weapons, his small frame. They saw a victim. Krell raised his axe and the laughter died away, replaced by a tense, hungry silence. "You're late, little liaison," Krell bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "I was starting to think you'd found a hole to crawl into." "I was just checking the specs on your armor," Jace said, his voice amplified by the arena's nodes. "Did you know your right shoulder actuator has a 4% lag in cold start conditions? You should really have your techs look at that." Krell's ears flattened. "You think your insults will save you? I am going to break every bone in your body, and then I am going to let the healers knit them back together just so I can break them again." "Sounds like a busy afternoon," Jace said. He took a breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, feeling the non-Newtonian fluid in his suit begin to circulate. He wasn't afraid. He was just ready. High Matriarch Alara stood on her balcony, her silver hair whipping in the wind. She raised a hand, and a silence so profound fell over the arena that the hum of the planet's core seemed to grow louder. "The law of the kinetic proof is in effect," she declared. "There will be no killing. There will be no retreat. Only the truth of the movement. Begin!" The chimes struck like a hammer against a bell, and the world dissolved into a blur of crimson and light. Krell moved with a speed that defied the laws of mass. The Titan core armor wasn't just a suit, it was a localized gravity well, its thrusters firing in micro-bursts to propel 2 tons of alloy and muscle across the arena floor. He didn't run. He surged, a wave of kinetic energy that left a glowing trail of heat in its wake. The plasma axe came down in a vertical smash that would have pulverized a tank. Jace Mercer didn't move until the blade was less than 50 centimeters from his skull. To the crowd, it looked like he had frozen in terror. To the sensors beneath the floor, it was a masterpiece of timing. Jace stepped left, his body tilting at an angle of exactly 15 degrees. The axe screamed past his ear, the heat from the plasma singing the fine hairs on his neck, and slammed into the floor with the force of a falling meteor. The alloy panels beneath Krell buckled, the energy dampeners turning a violent shade of purple as they struggled to absorb the impact. Jace didn't retreat. He stepped toward the massive warrior. As Krell struggled to wrench the embedded axe from the floor, Jace's hand blurred. He struck Krell twice, once on the wrist of his primary gauntlet and once on the neck seal where the armor's cooling lines converged. They weren't heavy blows. They were taps, almost delicate. But Jace's suit was programmed to deliver a focused ultrasonic pulse at the point of contact. Above the arena, the holographic display of Krell's armor lit up like a Christmas tree. An error code flashed in bright, flickering yellow. S-link disruption, cooling flow obstruction, 5% efficiency drop. The crowd gasped. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a collective intake of breath. 100,000 Valkyrs suddenly realizing that the gnat had bitten the giant. Krell roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He let go of the axe with one hand and swung a massive armored fist at Jace's head. The human dropped flat, the fist passing through the space his head had occupied a millisecond before. From his position on the floor, Jace kicked out, his boot connecting with the back of Krell's knee. Again, the ultrasonic pulse flared. Krell's leg buckled, the hydraulic fluid in the armor's joint momentarily seizing. The vanguard staggered, a 2-ton god stumbling like a drunkard. "What are you doing?" Krell hissed, his breath coming in ragged gasps through the helmet's vocoder. "Stand and fight me like a warrior. Stop this flickering." "I'm fighting you exactly where you live, Krell," Jace said, rolling backward and springing to his feet in a single fluid motion. "I'm fighting you in the math." Jace felt the familiar burn in his muscles. The gravity of Karis V was a constant weight, pulling at his lungs, straining his heart. He knew he couldn't maintain this pace for long. He had maybe 20 minutes before his body began to fail, regardless of how good his suit was. He needed to trigger the echoes. Krell wrenched his axe free, the metal screeching in protest. He didn't charge this time. He began to circle, his movements more cautious, his golden eyes fixed on Jace's throat. He realized now that he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting a ghost who knew his every weakness. "You think these little tricks will win?" Krell growled. "I have faced armies. I have stood at the center of firestorms. You are nothing but a glitch in the system." "A glitch can bring down an empire," Jace said. He tapped a command on his wrist. "Drone? Status?" "Neural map at 40%, the drone replied, hovering high above the fray. "I need more high-impact events." "He needs to hit the floor harder, Jace. The sensors need the vibration to unlock the archived logs." "Copy that," Jace whispered. He did something then that the Valkyr would never have expected. He stopped moving. He stood in the center of the arena, his arms spread wide, his chest exposed. He looked small. He looked vulnerable. He looked like a father standing in a corridor with a wrench. "Is this it?" Krell asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Have you finally realized you can't run forever?" Jace didn't answer. He just watched Krell's eyes. The Vanguard didn't hesitate. He saw the opening and he took it. He fired his shoulder thrusters, turning himself into a human-shaped projectile. He didn't use the axe. He used his entire body, intending to crush Jace against the arena floor. It was a tackle that would have ended 100 human lives. Jace waited. He waited until he could see the individual scratches on Krell's faceplate. He waited until he could smell the hot oil of the armor's servos. Then he went limp. He didn't resist the impact. He allowed his body to become a part of Krell's momentum. As the massive armored chest hit him, Jace's suit absorbed the initial shock, the non-Newtonian fluid turning into a solid plate for a microsecond before liquefying again. He wrapped his arms around Krell's waist and used his own legs to pivot, redirecting the Vanguard's forward energy into a rotational arc. It was a classic judo throw, amplified by 1,000% by the Valkyr's own gravity tech. Krell flew. The 2-ton warrior hit the arena floor 15 meters away with a sound that shook the entire crater. The impact was so violent that the energy dampeners in the floor failed entirely, sparking into a bright electrical blue. The basalt beneath the panels shattered, sending a shockwave through the stands that knocked several spectators off their feet. And then the echoes started. The Arena of Echoes wasn't just named for the way sound bounced off the walls. It was built on the site of the first Valkyr city, a place where the planet's unique electromagnetic field acted as a natural recording device. For centuries, the Valkyr had used it to store their history. But Jace's drone had tapped into the deep storage layers, the parts of the memory that the matriarch's sensors had buried. As the smoke cleared from Krell's impact, the holographic projectors above the arena didn't show the fight. They showed a grainy, flickering image of a red dust world, a habitation dome, a group of humans huddled in a corner, a girl with a synthetic doll, and a towering silhouette in crimson armor, raising a heat blade. The crowd went silent. This wasn't a tactical display. This wasn't combat data. This was a memory, a raw, unedited neural recording pulled directly from the black box of Krell's Titan core armor, triggered by the massive kinetic shock of the fall. The image on the screen was visceral. You could see the fear in the human's eyes. You could hear the high-pitched whistle of the escaping air. And you could hear Krell's voice, unamplified, coming through the suit's internal comms. "They're just miners," a voice in Krell's ear said. It was the commander of his support squad. "Sir, they're not armed. We should call for the transport units." Krell's recorded voice replied, cold and bored. "I'm not here to be a bus driver, Commander. I'm here to establish the law. Move them out." The screen showed the heat blade descending. It didn't show a battle. It showed a slaughter. Krell struggled to his feet, his armor sparking, his helmet cracked. He looked up at the screens, and for the first time in his long, blood-soaked life, the vanguard of the Valkyr looked small. "Shut it off!" he roared, swinging his axe at the nearest holographic node. "Shut it off! It's a trick! The human is a spy! He's hacking the archives!" Jace Mercer stood at the other end of the arena, his chest heaving, his suit torn in a dozen places. Blood was trickling from a cut above his eye, but his gaze was steady. "The data doesn't lie, Krell," Jace said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence of the crowd. "You didn't defeat an army at Sector 7. You didn't protect the heart of the Empire. You just killed people who were too tired to run away. You have no right," Krell whispered, his axe trembling in his hand. "You are a human. You are a nothing. I am a vanguard." "A warrior protects those who can't fight back," Jace said, taking a step forward. "You're just a bully with a big battery." The crowd was beginning to murmur now, a low, dangerous sound. The younger officers, the ones who had been raised on Krell's legends, were looking at each other with uncertain eyes. They had seen the truth, displayed in the very language they worshipped, the language of the kinetic proof. High Matriarch Alara remained on her balcony, her ears angled sharply forward. She didn't order the screens shut off. She didn't call for the guards. She just watched. Krell looked up at her, a plea for help in his eyes. But Alara's expression was as cold as the obsidian walls. She had known about Sector 7, but she had never seen it from the victim's perspective. She had never felt the terror through the neural links. "Vanguard Krell," she said, her voice echoing like a judgment. "The proof is not yet concluded. The human is still standing." Krell turned back to Jace, his fury replaced by a desperate, cornered, animalistic rage. He didn't care about the rules anymore. He didn't care about the law. He only cared about silencing the witness. He deactivated his axe and threw it aside. He reached for his belt and pulled out a heavy, high-velocity projectile pistol, a weapon strictly prohibited in a kinetic trial. The crowd gasped. The matriarch stood up, her hand raised to stop the duel, but Jace Mercer didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the gun. "You're proving my point, Krell," Jace said softly. "When you can't win with movement, you use force. When you can't win with force, you use murder. That's not a warrior's path. That's just a coward's habit." Krell leveled the pistol at Jace's heart. "I am the law," he screamed. He pulled the trigger. The bullet, a slab of solid tungsten, traveled at 5 times the speed of sound. In the gravity of Karis V, it should have punched a hole straight through Jace's chest and come out the other side. But Jace's kinetic suit had been waiting for this. The moment the muzzle flash erupted, the suit's dampeners pulled every erg of power from the reserve batteries. The non-Newtonian fluid didn't just harden, it pulsed. Jace didn't dodge. He caught the bullet. He didn't catch it with his hands. He caught it with the field of the suit. The tungsten round hit the air 10 centimeters in front of his chest and stopped. Its kinetic energy absorbed and converted into a blinding flash of white light. The heat from the impact melted the front of Jace's uniform, but the man himself didn't move an inch. The spent slug fell to the floor with a soft clink. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of 100,000 people realizing that everything they believed about the universe was wrong. Jace Mercer looked down at the bullet, then back at Krell. "Is that all you have?" Jace asked. "Because I've still got 9 minutes left on my watch." Krell dropped the pistol. He fell to his knees, the weight of his armor finally becoming too much for his pride to carry. He didn't surrender with words. He surrendered with the slump of his shoulders. Above the arena, the screens flickered again. The image of the little girl with the doll was back, but this time it was clear, stable, and haunting. She was looking right at the camera, right at the crowd. She wasn't screaming. She was just waiting. Jace walked toward Krell, his boots clicking softly on the alloy panels. He stopped a meter away and looked down at the broken Vanguard. "You didn't destroy them, Krell," Jace said, his voice quiet but clear. "You just made them a part of you. And now, they're a part of everyone else, too." He turned and looked up at the matriarch. "The duel is concluded, Your Majesty. I believe the data is sufficient." Ilara nodded, her long ears angled in a gesture of profound respect. "The proof is established," she whispered. Jace Mercer turned and walked back toward the tunnel, his shadow stretching out across the arena floor. He had saved no one today. Sector 7 was still a graveyard. Sarah Vance was still dead. But as he stepped into the darkness of the corridor, he felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. He felt like he could finally breathe. "Sit rep," he whispered to the drone. "Mission accomplished, Jace," the machine replied. "The data is already hitting the galactic nets. The whole sector is seeing it." Jace didn't smile. He just kept walking. The first layer had been peeled away, and the truth underneath was as cold and hard as the basalt heart of Karis V. The second half of the story had only just begun. The silence that followed the duel in the Arena of Echoes was not the silence of a vacuum, but rather the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a volcanic eruption. Jace Mercer sat in a small, windowless observation room high above the arena's primary floor. The walls were made of the same obsidian glass as the rest of Ethelgard, polished to such a high degree that he could see his own reflection staring back at him. He looked like a specter. His matte black suit was shredded at the shoulder, a jagged tear exposing the pale, bruised skin beneath. He had refused medical attention from the Valkyr healers, opting instead to seal the minor lacerations with a basic medical gel from his own kit. He sat on a floating grav bench, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue that felt like it had settled in his very marrow. He had done what he came to do. The data from the arena, the unedited, raw neural feedback from Vanguard Krell's own memory, was now vibrating across every public and private frequency on Karis V. It was also, if his drone's calculations were correct, currently leaping through the subspace relays toward the Terran Alliance. The door hissed open. Jace didn't look up. He knew the gate. It was heavy, rhythmic, and carried the faint whine of high-end servo motors. "You've caused a real few-bar situation out there, Mercer," a voice growled. Jace finally raised his head. Standing in the doorway was General Vorn, the leader of the Iron Fist faction within the Valkyr military. Vorn was older than Krell, his gray skin etched with the deep scars of 100 campaigns. He didn't wear the ceremonial armor of the court. He wore a functional combat chassis, dented and stained with the soot of the mining belts. He looked like he wanted to snap Jace's neck, but he also looked like he was seeing a ghost. "I simply provided the data, General," Jace said, his voice raspy. "What the people do with it is their business." "Data?" Vorn stepped into the room, the door sealing shut behind him. "You didn't just give them data. You ripped the heart out of our military identity. Krell was the standard. Every cadet on this rock grew up wanting to be that man. And you showed them a massacre." Jace stood up slowly, his joints popping. "I showed them what actually happened. If your standard is built on the blood of minors and children, then maybe it's time you got a new standard." Vorn's ears flattened against his skull, his golden eyes narrowing to slits. "You think you're slick, don't you? Using our own law against us. You human ghost ops are all the same. You play these mental games because you can't stand up in a fair fight." "A fair fight?" Jace laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You sent 3 shock pods into a civilian habitation dome that had 0 orbital defenses. You call that a fair fight? I spent 10 years waking up in a cold sweat because I could still hear the sound of that dome depressurizing. I didn't come here to play a game, Vorn. I came here to close a file." Vorn walked to the window, looking out over the city. Below, the streets were filled with Valkyr citizens. They weren't cheering. They were gathered in small, quiet clusters around the public projection pillars, watching the loop of the Sector 7 footage over and over. The illusion of the Vanguard's glory was dissolving in real time. "The matriarch is in an impossible position," Vorn said, his back to Jace. The council is split down the middle. Half of them want your head on a spike to prove that the footage was a human fabrication. The other half, they're starting to ask questions about the other victories Krell claimed. If this goes sideways, we're looking at a civil rift that will tear Ethelgard apart. Then give them the rest of the files, Jace suggested. Open the archives. If Krell is the only one who crossed the line, then deal with him. If the whole system is rotten, then burn it down and start over. You talk like someone who has nothing to lose, Vorn said, turning around. But you're a diplomat now, Mercer. Or at least that's the lie the Alliance told us. If you die in this room, the peace treaty dies with you. Our ships are already warming their jump drives. We could glass your remaining sectors in 48 hours. Then do it, Jace said, stepping closer to the massive general. If your only response to the truth is more murder, then you've already lost. My people might die, but your species will be the one that has to live with what you've become. Is that what you want? To be remembered as the empire that couldn't handle a mirror? Vorn stared at him for a long time. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical pressure. For a moment, Jace was certain the general was going to strike. But then Vorn's ears twitched, and he let out a slow, heavy exhale. You're a real piece of work, Mercer, a total suit monkey with the mouth of a veteran. I've been both, Jace replied. The general turned toward the door. The matriarch wants you moved to the inner sanctum. It's for your own safety. Some of the younger ground pounders are looking for a reason to go loud, and a dead human is a pretty good spark. Don't make me have to explain why I let you get cornered. Jace grabbed his gear bag and followed the general into the corridor. The walk through the palace was different now. The guards didn't sneer at him. They didn't mock his height or his lack of armor. They looked away when he passed. It was the look of people who had just realized they had been cheering for the villain of the story. As they passed the medical bay, Jace stopped. Through the transparent partition, he could see Vanguard Krell. The giant warrior was out of his armor, sitting on a table while a team of automated droids scanned his fractured joints. Without the Titan core, Krell looked smaller, his skin gray and mottled with the bruises Jace had inflicted. He was staring at his own hands, his expression one of profound, hollow confusion. He looks like he's seeing a ghost, Jace murmured. He is, Vorn said, not stopping. He's seeing 300 of them. They moved into the deeper parts of the palace, where the walls were reinforced with magnetic stabilizers to keep the tremors of the planet's core at bay. The air was cooler here, filtered through layers of scrubbers that removed the sulfur and ozone. Vorn led him to a suite of rooms that looked more like a high-security cell than a guest quarters. Stay here, Vorn ordered. Don't access the external nets. Don't talk to the service droids. Just sit tight while the brass figures out how to keep the world from ending. Jace watched the door slide shut and heard the heavy click of the magnetic locks. He was alone again. He walked to the center of the room and sat down on the floor, crossing his legs. He didn't want the bed. He didn't want the luxury. He wanted the stillness. But the stillness brought the memories. He closed his eyes and he was back in the tunnels. He could see Sarah Vance's face, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. She had been 42 years old, a mother of two who had signed up for the mining detail to pay for her daughter's education on Earth. She wasn't a soldier. She was just someone who knew how to fix a broken oxygen scrubber. Jace, get them out, she had said. Her voice was steady despite the fact that a Valkyr shock pod had just crushed the lower half of her body. Don't look back. Just get them to the shuttle. He had looked back. He had seen the crimson armor of the Vanguard entering the breach. He had seen the cold, mechanical efficiency of the slaughter. He had spent 10 years wondering if he could have done more, if he could have stayed, if he could have died with her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the synthetic doll. The melted plastic felt smooth against his thumb. I did it, Sarah, he whispered into the empty room. They know. The whole galaxy knows. But as he sat there in the dark, the victory felt like lead in his stomach. He had exposed the lie, but he hadn't changed the nature of the universe. The Valkyr were still powerful. The humans were still weak. And out in the dark between the stars, there were other empires, other vanguards, other Sector 7s waiting to happen. He realized then that the truth wasn't a destination. It was just a point of deflection. He had shifted the vector of the Valkyr Empire, but he had no idea where they were going to land. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His drone, which had been hiding in the ceiling recesses, drifted down. Jace, it whispered. I've intercepted a high-priority distress signal from the fractured belt. Jace frowned. That's outside Valkyr territory. Who's sending it? It's an automated beacon from a human research station, the drone said. Outpost 24. They're reporting an incursion by an unidentified hostile force. It's not the Valkyr. The signature is different. Jace stood up, his fatigue forgotten. Unidentified? Is it the swarm or the syndicate? The drone's optical sensor blinked. Data is fragmented, but the outpost is currently housing 400 civilians, mostly scientists and their families. They're calling for immediate evacuation. The nearest Alliance ship is 6 days away. Jace looked at the locked door. And the Valkyr? The Valkyr have a task force sitting in the neighboring sector, the drone said. They could be there in 4 hours. Jace's heart began to pound. He knew what would happen if he asked the Valkyr for help. The Iron Fist faction would see it as a chance to cleanse another sector. They would send in the shock pods, and they would call it a rescue, and 400 more humans would end up as footnotes in a bloody history book. Unless they went as something else. Open a line to the Matriarch's private office, Jace ordered. Use the ghost protocol I gave you. Jace, the drone cautioned. If you get caught hacking the palace comms, they'll execute you before you can say diplomatic immunity. I'm already a dead man walking, Jace said, his eyes narrowing. Just get me the line. The drone hummed, its internal processors whirring. A few seconds later, a translucent screen appeared in the air. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakably High Matriarch Alara. She was in her private study, her long ears angled in a gesture of deep fatigue. She saw Jace, and her expression shifted from surprise to a cold, regal curiosity. Mercer, she said, you are becoming a very expensive guest. Why are you bypassing my security protocols? We have a problem, Matriarch, Jace said, ignoring the question. Outpost 24 is under attack. 400 humans. Your ships are the only ones close enough to help. Alara leaned back, her silver hair shimmering. And why should I intervene? My people are currently debating whether to go to war with yours. Sending a task force to save your scientists would be seen as a sign of weakness by General Vorn and his supporters. It wouldn't be weakness if you sent Krell, Jace said. The Matriarch's ears stood straight up. Krell? He is a broken man. He is currently being investigated for war crimes. You destroyed him in the arena, Mercer. Why would you want him anywhere near your people? Because I want him to do his job, Jace said. I want him to be a warrior, not a killer. Give him a chance to be the hero he told everyone he was. Send him to protect the outpost. Send him to stand in front of the civilians instead of crushing them. Alara stared at him through the screen. You are asking me to trust a wolf to guard the sheep. I'm asking you to give the wolf a reason to stop biting, Jace countered. If Krell saves those people, it changes the narrative. It proves that the Valkyr can be more than just a hammer. It proves that your strength can be used for something other than domination. The silence stretched for 10 long seconds. Jace could see the gears turning in the Matriarch's mind. She was a politician, but she was also a Valkyr. She understood the power of a legend. If he fails, she said softly, if he kills even one civilian, I will have no choice but to authorize Vorn's full-scale invasion. I know, Jace said, and if you're wrong about him, if he's just a killer in a suit, then I'll be the first one he kills, Jace replied, because I'm going with him. The transport shuttle was a cramped, vibrating tube of cold metal and orange light. Jace Mercer sat strapped into a jump seat, his gear bag between his feet. Across from him, separated by 2 meters of floor space and a lifetime of hatred, sat Vanguard Krell. The giant was back in his armor, but the Titan core looked different. The bright crimson polish had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, dull gray of the alloy. The sigils of his kills had been ground off, leaving jagged scars across the chest plate. He didn't have his plasma axe. Instead, he carried a heavy, reinforced shield and a low-output stun baton. Krell hadn't spoken since they left Athelgard. He sat perfectly still, his helmet resting on his knees, his golden eyes fixed on the floor. He looked like a man waiting for his execution. You're thinking about the footage, Jace said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ion engines. Krell's ears twitched, but he didn't look up. I'm thinking about the way they didn't run. Jace frowned. Who? The ones in the Hab Dome, Krell said, his voice a low, hollow rumble. In the memories you showed. They didn't run. They just stood there. I always told myself they were waiting for an opening. I told myself they were hiding weapons. But they weren't. They were just waiting for it to be over. Jace leaned back, the vibration of the shuttle rattling his teeth. We call it shock. When the brain can't process the level of violence it's seeing, it just shuts down. It's not cowardice, Krell. It's just humanity. Why are you here? Krell asked, finally raising his eyes. You won. You stripped me of my honor. You turned my people against me. You should be back at your embassy, drinking your synthetic wine and celebrating. I'm not here to celebrate, Jace said. I'm here to make sure you don't mess this up. There are 400 people on that outpost. If you treat this like Sector 7, I'm going to kill you myself. Krell let out a short, dry laugh. With what? Your 2 fingers and an ultrasonic pulse? I'm in a 2-ton combat chassis, Mercer. You're in a fancy wetsuit. I don't need a suit to kill a man who has no reason to live, Jace said. And right now, you're looking pretty empty. Krell's jaw tightened, the bioluminescent veins in his neck glowing a faint dying amber. You think I want to be here? The matriarch gave me a choice, this mission or the scrap heap. She wants me to prove that I can be refined, like a piece of ore. You're more than ore, Jace said, leaning forward. You're a vanguard. You're supposed to be the best your species has to offer. So prove it, not by how many people you can kill, but by how many you can keep alive. The shuttle's comm system chirped. Vanguard Krell, this is Pilot Heck. We are approaching the Outpost 24 coordinates. Re-entry in 3 minutes. Visuals are coming through now. A small screen on the bulkhead flickered to life. The research station was a sprawling collection of silver modules perched on the edge of an ice plateau. It looked fragile against the dark, jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains. But the ice wasn't white anymore. It was stained with streaks of black and purple. Dozens of small, multi-legged shapes were swarming over the station's outer hull. They looked like mechanical spiders, their limbs ending in white-hot cutting torches. The scavengers, Jace whispered, his blood turning to ice. Krell stood up, his armor's servos whining as they locked into combat mode. I've faced them before. They don't have a central command. They just eat. They'll strip the station of its atmosphere in 10 minutes. Then we've got 9, Jace said, grabbing his helmet. The shuttle's ramp dropped before the craft had even touched the ice. The freezing wind of the plateau whipped into the cabin, carrying the smell of ozone and burning plastic. Krell jumped first. He didn't use his thrusters for a soft landing. He hit the ice like a falling star, the shock wave of his impact shattering the frozen surface for 10 meters in every direction. 2 of the scavenger drones were crushed instantly beneath his boots. Jace followed, his kinetic suit instantly adjusting to the sub-zero temperatures. He felt the familiar weight of the gravity, but he used it, rolling into a crouch and deploying his maintenance drone. Drone mapped the interior. Jace shouted over the roar of the wind. Find the survivors! Krell was already moving toward the station's primary airlock. He didn't use his stun baton. He used the shield. He swung the massive slab of alloy like a hammer, smashing the scavenger drones into scrap metal. He didn't charge through them. He formed a perimeter, his movements economical and precise. Mercer, Krell bellowed. The airlock is breached. I can't hold the exterior and clear the interior at the same time. I'm on it, Jace shouted. Just keep the swarm off the hull. If they breach the main reactor, this whole plateau becomes a crater. Jace ran toward the jagged hole in the station side. He moved like a shadow, slipping through the gaps in the scavenger's formation. He didn't have a shield. He didn't have a blade. He had the geometry of the movement. He used the scavenger's own weight against them, stepping aside at the last second and letting them crash into the icy walls. Inside the station, the air was thin and freezing. The emergency lights were flickering, casting long, distorted shadows down the narrow corridors. Jace could hear the high-pitched shriek of the scavengers tearing through the metal. He reached the central laboratory. A group of 30 scientists were huddled in the corner, holding pieces of equipment like primitive clubs. They looked up as Jace entered, their eyes wide with a terror that he knew all too well. "I'm Jace Mercer, Terran Alliance," he shouted. "Is everyone here?" "Most of them," a woman cried, her voice shaking. "But the others are trapped in the lower levels." "The machines? They're everywhere." "Stay here," Jace ordered. "Seal the door." He turned and ran toward the lower levels. The drone was hovering in front of him, projecting a map of the station into the air. "Jace," the drone warned, "there are 50 signatures in the sub-basement, and one very large one, a Harvester-class drone." "How far?" Jace asked, his lungs burning. "2 levels down. It's already through the primary blast door." Jace hit the stairs, jumping the entire flight and landing in a roll. He reached the sub-basement just as the Harvester-class drone, a massive 6-legged monstrosity the size of a small tank, was beginning to melt its way into the final safe room. Behind the door, Jace could hear the sound of children crying. He didn't think. He didn't have time for a plan. He ran straight at the Harvester. The machine sensed him and pivoted, its central eye glowing a lethal, focused red. It fired a pulse of thermal energy that scorched the air, but Jace was already gone. He used the wall as a springboard, flipping over the Harvester and landing on its back. He jammed his hands into the sensor array at the base of the machine's neck. He didn't try to pull it apart. He didn't have the strength. He used his suit's ultrasonic pulse, sending a high-frequency vibration directly into the Harvester's central processor. The machine shrieked, its legs buckling. But it didn't stop. It began to spin, trying to throw him off. Jace held on, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring. And then the wall exploded. Vanguard Krell burst through the reinforced concrete, his armor covered in the black ichor of the scavenger drones. He didn't look at the Harvester. He looked at Jace. "Get back," Krell roared. The giant warrior stepped forward and slammed his shield into the Harvester's side. The impact was thunderous, sending the machine skidding across the floor. Krell didn't stop. He threw himself onto the Harvester, his hands gripping the machine's limbs. He wasn't smashing it. He was holding it. He was acting as a physical anchor, keeping the machine away from the door where the children were hidden. The Harvester fought back, its cutting torches searing through Krell's armor. Jace could see the sparks flying, could hear the warning sirens of the Titan core. Krell was taking the damage. He was absorbing the heat. He was being the shield. "Mercer!" Krell gasped, his voice strained. "The reactor, under the chassis, hit the kill switch." Jace dropped from the ceiling, sliding under the Harvester's thrashing legs. He saw the glowing blue core of the machine's reactor. He reached out and slammed his palm against the emergency release. The Harvester shuddered one last time and went dark. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Krell's heavy, mechanical breathing. The Vanguard let go of the machine and slumped against the wall, his armor blackened and smoking. He looked at the door to the safe room. Are they all right?" Krell asked. Jace walked to the door and tapped the override. The door slid open, revealing 40 scientists and a dozen children. They looked at Jace, and then they looked at the massive, terrifying warrior in the broken armor. They didn't run. They didn't scream. A small boy, no older than 6, stepped out of the room. He looked at Krell, his eyes wide. "Are you a hero?" the boy asked. Krell looked at the boy, and then he looked at Jace. His golden eyes were wet. The bioluminescent veins in his neck had gone completely dark. "I'm trying to be," Krell whispered. Jace walked over and put a hand on Krell's armored shoulder. It was hot to the touch, but the vibration of the servos was steady. "Nice work, Vanguard," Jace said. "You only overcorrected by about 10% on that wall." Krell let out a short, ragged laugh. "I'll work on it." As they led the survivors out of the station and toward the waiting shuttle, Jace looked up at the sky. The scavenger swarm was gone, chased away by the arrival of the Valkyr task force. The Iron Fist ships were hovering in orbit, their weapons locked onto the plateau. But they didn't fire. Jace knew that back on Ethelgard, the matriarch was watching. She was seeing the data. She was seeing a Vanguard standing in the snow, surrounded by human children. She was seeing the narrative change. He looked at the synthetic doll in his pocket. It felt lighter now. "We're not there yet, Sarah," Jace thought, "but the math is starting to look a lot better." The cost of the lesson had been high. It had cost Jace his career, his safety, and his peace of mind. It had cost Krell his glory and his certainty. But as they boarded the shuttle, Side by side, Jace realized that the cost of not learning it would have been the end of everything. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a massacre. It looked like a challenge. The transition from the freezing silence of the ice plateau to the suffocating heat of Ethelgard was a violent reminder of Karis V's dual nature. As the transport shuttle hissed into the docking cradle, Jace Mercer felt the magnetic clamps lock onto the hull with a series of heavy metallic thuds. Each vibration rattled through the frame of his jump seat, echoing the pounding in his chest. Across from him, Vanguard Krell sat like a statue carved from cooling magma. His armor was a wreck of scorched plating and exposed wiring, yet he had refused to remove the helmet. The golden visor remained dark, reflecting nothing but the flickering amber lights of the shuttle's interior. They weren't greeted by healers or a welcoming committee. When the ramp lowered, the docking bay was lined with 24 soldiers from the Iron Fist faction, their rifles held at the low-ready position. General Vorn stood at the center of the formation, his gray skin appearing almost translucent under the harsh ultraviolet lamps of the hangar. His long ears were pulled back tight against his skull, a sign of extreme aggression that even a human like Jace could read without a translator. "Vanguard Krell," Vorn said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You were sent to provide a tactical assessment. Instead, you turned a rescue mission into a public relations disaster. Do you have any idea what the streets look like right now?" Krell stood up, his armor groaning in protest. "I did what the matriarch commanded, General. I secured the outpost. I protected the assets." "Assets?" Vorn stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the metal ramp. "You brought back 40 human suit monkeys and a dozen larvae. You allowed yourself to be recorded carrying them like a common pack beast. The footage is already being used by the reformers to argue for a complete withdrawal from the neutral zones. You've turned our strength into a joke." Jace unbuckled his harness and stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't have a weapon, and his kinetic suit was at 20% power, but he stepped between the two Valkyr giants anyway. It wasn't a tactical move, it was an instinct. "The kids aren't larvae, General," Jace said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline-fueled tremor in his hands. "They're survivors, and Krell didn't make you look weak. He made you look like something other than a butcher for the first time in 50 years. Vorn's gaze snapped to Jace, the human diplomat, the ghost op who thinks he can rewrite our history with a few ultrasonic taps. "You're the reason this situation is foobar. You've poisoned the Vanguard's mind with your Terran sentimentality." Vorn raised a hand, and two of the Iron Fist soldiers stepped forward, their stun batons crackling with electric blue energy. "Take the human to the high-security block. He's to be held in total isolation until the Council decides how to handle his execution. As for Krell, strip him of that armor. He's no longer fit to wear the Titan core." Krell's ears twitched, a sudden, violent motion. "No." The word was a growl that filled the hangar. Krell didn't reach for a weapon, but the atmosphere in the bay changed instantly. The air felt heavier, charged with the localized gravity well of the Vanguard's armor. "You dare defy a direct order?" Vorn hissed, his own hand moving to the hilt of his heavy command blade. "You're a disgrace, Krell. You've forgotten the law. Strength is everything, and you've become soft." "I've become clear," Krell replied. He stepped off the ramp, his massive shadow falling over the general. "I've spent a century following your orders, Vorn. I've burned settlements and called it glory. I've crushed resistance and called it peace. But sitting in that shuttle with those children, I realized that I wasn't afraid of the scavengers. I was afraid of looking in a mirror." Vorn didn't wait for another word. He drew his blade, a massive slab of vibrating obsidian, and swung it in a brutal horizontal arc. The move was intended to take Krell's head, a summary execution in the middle of a docking bay. Krell was too damaged to move. His servos were misfiring, his reactor was in the red, and his left leg was locked in a safety shunt. He braced for the impact, his eyes closing. He didn't feel the blade. Jace Mercer had moved. He didn't lunge and he didn't block. He stepped into the geometry of the strike, the same way he had in the arena. He placed his hand against Vorn's leading wrist and his other hand against the general's elbow. He didn't push. He simply redirected the momentum of the 200-kilogram Valkyr. The obsidian blade hissed through empty air, passing inches from Krell's visor. Vorn, caught in the sudden absence of resistance, stumbled forward, his own weight carrying him into the side of the shuttle. The metal hull buckled with a loud, ringing boom. The Iron Fist soldiers froze. They had never seen a human touch a general, let alone throw one off balance. "That's enough," Jace said, his breathing shallow. The kinetic suit's warning lights were flashing a frantic red. "I'm not letting you turn this into another Sector 7. Vorn pushed himself away from the shuttle, his face a mask of pure, murderous hatred. You piece of dust. Ooh. You think you can use your technician tricks on me?" He raised the blade again, but this time he wasn't alone. The soldiers leveled their rifles at Jace. "General, stop!" The voice came from the far end of the hangar. High Matriarch Alara marched toward them, her silver robes billowing like a storm cloud. She wasn't accompanied by her usual honor guard. She was alone, but she carried the weight of 1,000 years of authority. Her elongated ears were angled sharply forward, and her eyes were fixed on Vorn. "This is a docking bay, not a slaughterhouse," Alara declared. "Lower your weapons." "Your Majesty," Vorn said, trying to regain his composure. "The human assaulted a ranking officer. The Vanguard has committed treason by refusing to surrender his equipment. I am merely enforcing the law." "The law is mine to interpret, Vorn," Alara said, stopping 3 meters from the group. "Not yours. Krell acted under my direct authorization at Outpost 24. The human was there as my personal observer. Any action taken against them is an action taken against the throne." Vorn's jaw flexed. "You're shielding them? After what they've done to our reputation? The people are rioting in the lower tiers. They think we're weak." "The people are questioning," Alara corrected. "There is a difference. And if they think we are weak because we chose to save lives instead of ending them, then perhaps our definition of strength is what needs to be rioted against." She turned to Jason Krell. "Follow me, now." Vorn watched them go, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade so hard that the obsidian began to hum. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told Jace that the general wasn't done. This wasn't a victory, it was a stay of execution. They walked through the private corridors of the palace, away from the prying eyes of the military. The air here was cooler, smelling of the white lilies that grew in the matriarch's hydroponic gardens. Alara didn't speak until they reached her private sanctum, a room filled with ancient scrolls and holographic star charts. "Sit," she commanded. Jace collapsed into a stone chair, his body finally beginning to shake from the adrenaline crash. Krell remained standing, though he leaned heavily against a pillar. "You've put me in an impossible position, Mercer," Alara said, walking to the window. "Vorn has the support of the majority of the military council. They don't care about the truth of Sector 7. They only care about the stability of the Empire. To them, you are a virus that needs to be purged." "And what am I to you?" Jace asked. Alara turned to him, her expression softening for the first time. "You are a reminder of why we left the caves in the first place. You're a man who stood in front of a vanguard with nothing but his own skin. That takes a kind of courage that most of my people have forgotten." She looked at Krell. "And you, my champion. You've lost your rank, your armor is in pieces, and half of your brothers want you dead. Was it worth it?" Krell slowly removed his helmet. His face was covered in soot and blood, his skin a dull, bruised gray. He looked at Jace, and then at the matriarch. "For the first time in 100 years, I don't have a headache," Krell said. "The noise in my head, the screaming from the settlements, it's quiet. So yes, it was worth it." Alara nodded slowly. "Good, because tomorrow, Vorn is going to move for a vote of no confidence in the High Council. He's going to claim that the footage from the arena was a human fabrication, a psychological weapon designed to soften us before an Alliance invasion. He has his own data to prove it. Can he win?" Jace asked. "If the Council believes him, yes," Alara said. "And if he wins, he will take control of the military. His first act will be to launch a preemptive strike on Earth's remaining colonies. He's already calling it the Great Purification." Jace stood up, the synthetic doll in his pocket feeling like it weighed 1,000 kilograms. "We can't let that happen. We have the data from the outpost. We have the testimony of the survivors. Testimony from humans won't matter in the High Council," Krell said, his voice heavy. "They'll call it brainwashing. They need a Valkyr witness, someone they can't ignore." Ilara looked at Krell. "They won't listen to a disgraced vanguard either." Unless what?" Jace asked. "Unless the truth doesn't come from a person," Ilara said, her eyes lighting up with a dangerous idea. "Unless it comes from the heart of Ethelgard itself." She walked over to a console and tapped in a series of high-level security codes. A map of the city appeared in the air, but it wasn't a map of the buildings. It was a map of the energy conduits. "The Arena of Echoes is built over the primary memory well of the planet," she explained, "but there is a second well. The Well of the Ancestors. It's located directly beneath the High Council chamber. It was designed to record every debate, every law, and every judgment since the founding of the city. It's supposed to be incorruptible." "Supposed to be?" Jace asked. "Vorn has had his tech priests working on it for years," Ilara said. "They've installed filters. They've scrubbed the recordings that didn't fit the military narrative. But the original data is still there, buried under layers of encryption and ghost code. If we can unlock that well during the council session," Jace realized, "we can show them everything. Not just Sector 7, but every victory Vorn has ever claimed. We can show them the reality of the expansion." "It's a suicide mission," Krell said. "The well is guarded by Vorn's personal elite squad. And the encryption? Even our best slicers haven't been able to crack it." "I'm not a slicer," Jace said, looking at his battered maintenance drone. "But I've got a little friend who knows a lot about ghost protocols. And I've got a suit that can get me through the security grid if I can find a way to boost the power." Krell looked at Jace, his golden eyes narrowing. "You'd risk going back into the tunnels? If you're caught down there, there are no rules. They'll erase you." "I've already been erased once," Jace said. 10 years ago at Sector 7. This time, I'm choosing where I stand." Krell stood up straight, his servos whining as he forced his broken armor to respond. "Then I'm going with you? I might not have an axe, but I can still be a shield." "No," Ilara said. "Krell, you need to be in the council chamber. You need to stand there and face Vorn. You need to be the distraction. If you aren't there, he'll know something is wrong. You have to endure his insults, his lies, and his judgment. You have to buy Mercer the time he needs." Krell looked at his hands, then at Jace. "It's a hard drop, little liaison." "I've had worse," Jace said. "Just make sure you don't let him win the vote before I get the signal out." Krell nodded, a slow, solemn motion. "I'll hold the line." As they prepared for the night ahead, Jace felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't about a duel anymore. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the difference between a society built on a lie and one built on the truth. He looked at the matriarch, who was already preparing her speech for the morning. She was risking her throne, her life, and her legacy for a chance at a different kind of strength. "Is there any chance we walk away from this?" Jace asked. Ilara didn't look up from her console. In a universe governed by the kinetic proof, Mercer, the only way to walk away is to never stop moving. Jace checked his suit one last time. He had 5 hours until the council session began. 5 hours to navigate a maze of volcanic tunnels, bypass an elite security squad, and unlock the memories of a planet. It was a terrible plan. It was almost certainly going to fail. But as he looked at Krell, he saw a man who was no longer afraid of the mirror. And that, Jace realized, was a start. The High Council chamber was a cathedral of obsidian and light, its ceiling lost in a haze of artificial star clouds. Around the central floor, the representatives of the great houses sat in tiered rows, their armor polished to a mirror shine, their long ears twitching with the nervous energy of a nation on the brink. High Matriarch Ilara sat upon her throne, her silver hair appearing like a halo against the dark stone. She looked regal, but her hands were gripped tight on the armrests, her knuckles white. General Vorn stood at the center of the floor, his voice echoing through the chamber with the force of an orbital bombardment. "We are a species of warriors," Vorn bellowed. "We were forged in the fires of Karis V. We did not become masters of this sector by being refined. Ahana, we did not build Ethelgard by asking for permission to survive." A murmur of agreement rippled through the tiers. Vorn had spent the last hour painting a picture of a Valkyr empire under siege by human deception. He had presented doctored sensor logs and expert testimony suggesting that the humans at Sector 7 had been armed with biological weapons, and that Krell's actions had been a necessary quarantine. And now, Vorn continued, turning his gaze toward the back of the chamber, our own champion stands before us, poisoned by the very vermin he was sent to exterminate. Look at him. All eyes turned toward Vanguard Krell. He stood near the entrance, his armor stripped of its plates, wearing only the gray under-chassis. He looked exposed, his scarred skin visible for all to see. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't even have a helmet. He stood perfectly still, enduring the stares and the whispers. He claims to have found his conscience, Vorn sneered. I say he has lost his nerve. He has allowed a human suit monkey to hack his mind, to rewrite his memories and to turn him into a puppet of the Terran Alliance. If we allow this treason to stand, we are inviting our own destruction. Krell stepped forward, his footsteps heavy on the obsidian floor. I haven't lost my nerve, General. I've found my eyes. Lies, Vorn shouted. You're a shell, a hollowed-out ghost. I am a Valkyr, Krell said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. And as a Valkyr, I have the right to speak before the Council. I have seen the reality of our great victories. I have felt the heat of our blades against people who couldn't even stand in our gravity. If that is what makes us strong, then we are already dead. We're just too proud to fall over. Vorn laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You talk of weakness as if it were a virtue. Matriarch, I call for the vote. Let the Council decide. Do we follow the path of our ancestors, or do we follow a broken man and a human spy into the grave? Ilara raised her hand. Before we vote, General, there is the matter of the well. Vorn's ears flattened. The well of the ancestors? What does that have to do with this? The law of the kinetic proof states that the truth must be verified by the most accurate record available, Ilara said, and there is no record more accurate than the well itself. I have ordered a full decryption of the archives from the last 10 cycles. Vorn's expression didn't flicker, but Jace, watching through the drone's optical link from 3 levels below, saw the General's heart rate spike on the tactical overlay. Your Majesty, Vorn said, his voice tight. The well is sacred. It is not to be tampered with by outsiders. It is not being tampered with, Vorn, Ilara said. It is being opened. In the tunnels beneath the chamber, Jace Mercer was crawling through a narrow ventilation shaft, the heat of the magma conduits making his vision swim. He was sweating through his suit, his lungs burning with every breath. Beside him, the maintenance drone was chirping in a frantic, low-volume staccato. Jace, we've got 3 clackers on the next level, the drone whispered, and the security grid is resetting every 40 seconds. If we don't hit the main terminal in the next 3 minutes, the whole sub-level goes into lockdown. I'm moving, Jace gasped. He slid out of the shaft and dropped onto a catwalk made of reinforced grating. Below him, the well of the ancestors glowed with a deep, pulsating violet light. It was a massive cylinder of crystalline memory cells, surrounded by a forest of cooling tubes and data conduits. At the base of the cylinder, 4 Iron Fist guards were patrolling the perimeter. They weren't wearing ceremonial armor. They were in full combat gear, their thermal goggles scanning the darkness. Drone, give me a distraction, Jace ordered. Something loud. The drone didn't hesitate. It detached a small localized EMP charge and dropped it into a nearby power junction. A second later, the lights in the tunnel flared and died, followed by a shower of sparks and the high-pitched whine of a failing stabilizer. The guards immediately moved toward the junction, their rifles raised. Jace didn't wait. He jumped from the catwalk, using his kinetic suit to soften the landing. He sprinted toward the primary terminal, his hands moving over the interface before he had even come to a full stop. Accessing the core, Jace whispered. The terminal was protected by a series of biometric locks and encryption layers that would have taken a team of hackers weeks to bypass. But Jace wasn't trying to hack it. He was using the Ghost protocol he had recovered from the Sector 7 archives. A backdoor built into the system by the original engineers, who had grown tired of the military's interference. Come on, Jace muttered, his fingers blurring over the touchpads. A red warning light flashed on the screen. Unauthorized access detected. Security response initiated. "Jace," the drone shouted. "We've got company." Jace didn't look back. He heard the sound of heavy boots on the grating, the crackle of stun batons, and the mechanical whir of a security turret deploying from the ceiling. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a projectile skimmed his suit, the kinetic dampeners failing to absorb the full force of the impact. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but he kept his hands on the terminal. One more layer, just one more. Above him in the council chamber, the tension had reached a breaking point. Vorn was shouting, his supporters standing up and calling for the matriarch's removal. Krell was standing his ground, his eyes fixed on the empty air in the center of the room. "The vote is called," Vorn roared. "All those in favor of the great purification, stand." More than half of the council began to rise. Elara looked at the door, her ears trembling. She had lost. The gamble hadn't paid off. And then, the air in the chamber shifted. The violet light from the floor intensified, turning the obsidian walls into a giant projection screen. The holographic star charts vanished, replaced by a series of cascading data streams that flowed like a river of light. The council froze. The images began to appear. They weren't grainy or flickering like the arena footage. They were crystal clear, three-dimensional, and filled with the terrifying detail of reality. The first was from the Battle of Oros 9. The official history books called it a heroic defense against a pirate fleet. But the well showed the truth. It showed a Valkyr fleet opening fire on a refugee convoy that was trying to flee the system. It showed the orders being given by a younger, less scarred General Vorn. "They're carrying supplies we need," Vorn's recorded voice echoed through the chamber. "If we let them jump, we lose the fuel. Target the engines. Leave no witnesses." The council gasped. Several of the nobles who had stood up slowly sat back down, their faces pale. The images shifted. One victory after another was revealed for what it truly was. The conquest of the belt, the pacification of the moons of Ignis. Each one was a story of efficiency over morality, of strength used to crush the weak for the sake of resources and ego. And then finally it showed Sector 7. It showed the entire sequence. The deployment of the shock pods, the collapsing domes, the families screaming in the dark. But it showed something else. It showed the conversation between Vorn and Krell after the slaughter. "The human team is dead, Vanguard," Vorn said, his image appearing 10 meters tall in the center of the chamber. "Good. Now write the report. Tell the people we faced a battalion of Terran insurgents. Tell them we protected the border. They need a hero, Krell. Don't disappoint them." Krell's recorded voice, heavy with a fatigue that had lasted 10 years, replied, "And the children, General?" "There were no children," Vorn said, his eyes cold. "There was only the enemy. Remember that." The recording ended, and the silence that followed was so profound that it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. General Vorn stood at the center of the floor, his face a mask of frozen rage. He looked at the council, seeing the disgust and the horror in their eyes. He looked at Elara, who was watching him with a pity that was more insulting than any accusation. This is a fabrication," Vorn screamed, though his voice sounded small and desperate in the vast chamber. "The human has tampered with the well. It's a trick." "The data doesn't lie, Vorn," Krell said, stepping forward. For the first time, he didn't look like a disgraced warrior. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden too heavy to carry. "The well doesn't have an agenda. It only has the movement. And the movement shows that you've been a coward for 50 years. "You dare call me a coward?" Vorn lunged at Krell, his hands reaching for the Vanguard's throat. "You're the one who couldn't finish the job. You're the one who let a human tell you what to think." Krell didn't strike back. He didn't use his massive strength to crush Vorn. He simply stepped aside, the same way Jace had taught him. He let Vorn's own momentum carry him past, and then he caught the general's arm, pinning it behind his back with a precise, clinical efficiency. "It's over, Vorn," Krell said. "The law's established." The truth is in the echoes. In the tunnels below, Jace Mercer was slumped against the terminal, his suit smoking, his blood staining the floor. He had been hit twice more, and his left arm was hanging limp at his side. The security turret was a heap of scrap metal, and the guards were unconscious on the floor, taken out by the final pulse of his kinetic suit's batteries. Jace, the drone whispered, its own chassis dented and scarred. The signal is out. They saw it all. I know, Jace whispered, his eyes closing. I heard the silence. Is it finished? Not yet, Jace said, his voice fading. But the math is finally right. As the palace guards entered the sub-level to retrieve him, Jace felt the synthetic doll in his pocket. He thought about Sarah Vance. He thought about the kids at the outpost. He thought about a universe where strength wasn't measured by how much you could destroy, but by how much you were willing to save. He had spent his life running from the ghosts of Sector 7, but as he was lifted onto a stretcher, surrounded by the very people who had once hunted him, Jace Mercer realized that he wasn't running anymore. He was just resting. And for a man who had spent 10 years in a cold sweat, that was victory enough. The medical bay in the Royal Wing did not hum with the aggressive industrial vibration of the military clinics Jace Mercer was used to. Instead, it was filled with a low, melodic chime that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He floated in a vat of translucent, amber-tinted nutrient gel, his body suspended by gentle magnetic tethers. Through the thick glass, the world of Ethelgard was a blur of orange and violet shadows. He felt weightless, a sensation that should have been terrifying for a man who had spent his life fighting the crushing gravity of hostile worlds. But here, it felt like the only peace he had ever known. He had been in the tank for 3 days. The damage to his skeletal structure from the tunnel collapse and the repetitive, kinetic stress of the duel had been severe. His left shoulder had been a mess of shattered bone and torn ligaments, and his internal organs had suffered from the localized pressure waves of Vorn's projectile pistol. On Earth, he would have been a candidate for a permanent cybernetic replacement or a very long, painful retirement. But Valkyr medical technology, fueled by the same geothermal energy that powered their weapons, was terrifyingly efficient. They didn't just patch you up, they forced your cells to remember who they were before the trauma. As the gel began to drain, Jace felt the heavy pull of Karis V returning. It was like a giant hand pressing him back into the earth. The glass slid open, and the cooling air hit his skin, smelling of sterilized ozone and the faint, sweet scent of the matriarch's gardens. Easy there, Mercer, a voice said. You're still a bit of a basket case. Jace blinked, wiping the residual gel from his eyes. General Vorn was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood Krell. The former Vanguard was not wearing a stitch of armor. He was dressed in a simple, loose-fitting robe of dark gray fabric, his slate-colored skin looking healthier than Jace had ever seen it. His long ears were relaxed, curved slightly backward in a gesture of calm that looked entirely foreign on his massive frame. Krell? Jace croaked, his voice sounding like sandpaper. The giant offered a steadying hand as Jace stepped out of the vat. His grip was firm but lacked the bone-crushing intensity of their previous encounters. I'm told the human respiratory system takes a few minutes to recalibrate after the tank. Don't try to give me a lecture on logistics just yet. Jace sat on the edge of a floating medical slab, wrapping a thermal blanket around his shivering shoulders. What happened? The council? The vote? Vorn is in the deep, Krell said, his voice a low rumble. He's awaiting a formal tribunal. After the well opened up and showed his highlights reel, there wasn't a noble in the city who wanted to be seen standing next to him. The Iron Fist faction didn't even put up a fight. They just dropped their gear and melted into the shadows. They're soldiers, Mercer. They know when the terrain has shifted. And the matriarch? She's busy, Krell said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She's spending 18 hours a day explaining to the great houses why we aren't going to glass the human colonies. It's a hard sell, but she's got the data from Outpost 24 on loop in the public plazas. People are seeing the footage of us, of me, standing with those kids. It's hard to call someone an inferior species when you've just seen your greatest warrior holding their hand. Jace exhaled, a long, shaky breath. So it worked. The data didn't lie. It never does, Krell replied, but humans sure do. You're a real piece of work, Mercer. You walked into the heart of an empire with a toy drone and a wetsuit, and you managed to derail 100 years of military doctrine. That's some high-level snafu you pulled off. I just stepped aside, Krell, Jace whispered. Krell barked a short laugh. Yeah, you keep saying that, but I've been thinking about it. While you were floating in that soup, I went back to the arena of echoes. I stood exactly where we fought. I looked at the floor, at the scars I left with my axe, and I realized something. You didn't just step aside from my strikes. You stepped aside from the entire way we've been living. You forced us to miss the target we've been aiming at for centuries. Jace looked at his hands. They were steady now. The gel had done its work. And what's the new target? I don't know yet, Krell admitted, sitting on a stone bench that looked too small for him. But for the first time in my life, I'm not waking up with a headache. I'm not hearing the screaming from Sector 7. I mean, the ghosts are still there, Mercer. They're always going to be there. But they aren't screaming. They're just watching, like they're waiting to see what I do next. A secondary character entered the room, the young cadet from the prep chamber, the one who had called Jace a suit rat. He looked different now. His armor was gone, replaced by a technician's vest. He carried a small tray with a flask of water and a bowl of nutrient broth. He approached Jace, but he didn't look at the ceiling this time. He looked Jace right in the eye. The matriarch says you need to eat, the cadet said. His ears were angled forward in a sign of genuine respect. And I'm sorry about the things I said, about the cowardice. I saw the footage from the well. My brother was at the Ignis Moons. I always thought he died in a glorious charge. Jace took the tray. And? The cadet swallowed hard. He died trying to stop a shock pod from hitting a civilian transport. Vorn's record said he was KIA by an insurgent mine, but the well showed the truth. He was killed by his own commander for refusing to fire on the transport. The room went silent, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a heavy mist. Your brother was a warrior, Jace said softly. He was the only real soldier in that sector. The cadet nodded, a single tear tracking down his gray skin. Thank you, sir. As the cadet left, Krell watched him go. That kid is one of thousands, Mercer. The whole planet is finding out that their family legacies are built on a heap of junk. It's going to be a long road back. Some of them are going to want to go back to the old ways. It's easier to be a killer than it is to be a person. Which one are you going to be? Jace asked. Krell stood up, his massive frame blocking out the orange light of the volcanic sky. I'm going to be a teacher. The matriarch wants me to head the new defense academy. No more shock pods, no more purification raids. We're going to teach the next generation how to differentiate, how to protect, how to hold the line without crossing it. It's going to be a real grind, but I think I've got the hang of the movement. Jace smiled, a real one this time. Just remember the 4% lag on the right shoulder, Krell. I've already had the tech strip the actuators. Krell grinned. I'm going back to basics. No more batteries doing the heavy lifting for me. If I can't move my own weight, I shouldn't be on the floor. They spent the next few hours in a quiet, comfortable silence, watching the ion storms dance across the horizon of Ethelgard. The city was changing. You could feel it in the air. The tension was shifting from the brittle, snapping energy of a fortress under siege to the restless, uncertain vibration of a world rediscovering its soul. The humanistic theme Jace had brought with him, the idea that strength was not the absence of resistance, but the presence of restraint, was no longer just a theory. It was becoming a policy. It was becoming a way of life. But Jace knew he couldn't stay. He was a ghost from a past that Karis V needed to move beyond. He was a reminder of a shame that needed to be processed, not dwelled upon. And he had his own world to go back to, a world that was still small, still fragile, and still very much afraid of the dark. I'm leaving tomorrow, Jace said. Krell nodded. I figured. The matriarch has your shuttle prepped. She's sending you back with a full diplomatic escort and a cargo bay full of thermal core reactors. A gift for your colonies. A down payment on a different kind of future. Jace looked at the synthetic doll resting on the table next to his bed. He picked it up, the charred plastic feeling familiar and grounded. I think I'll leave this here. Krell looked at the doll, his golden eyes reflecting the soft, amber light of the room. Why? Because she's home, Jace said. She doesn't need to be a ghost anymore. She can be a lesson. Krell took the doll, his huge fingers cradling the small toy with a gentleness that would have been impossible a week ago. I'll put it in the academy lobby. First thing the cadets see when they walk in. A reminder of what we're actually defending. As the sun set over Ethelgard, casting long, bloody shadows across the basalt towers, Jace Mercer lay back on his bed and closed his eyes. He didn't dream of the tunnels. He didn't dream of the screams. He dreamed of a girl with a doll, walking in a field of green grass under a blue sky that didn't want to kill her. It was a simple dream, a human dream, and for the first time in 10 years, it was enough. The day of departure arrived with a rare clarity. The ion storms had retreated to the poles, leaving the sky over Ethelgard a pale, shimmering copper that felt almost peaceful. The docking bay was no longer a gauntlet of hostile rifles. Instead, a unified guard of Valkyr and a small contingent of Terran security stood in two perfect, parallel lines, their weapons held at a formal salute. It was the physical manifestation of the Ethelgard Accord, a treaty that didn't just end a war, but established a shared responsibility for the sectors between their worlds. Jace Mercer walked toward his shuttle, his steps measured and steady. He no longer wore the shredded kinetic suit. He was back in his matte black diplomatic uniform, cleaned and pressed by the palace staff. He looked like a man who had regained his rank, but the change in him was deeper than his clothes. The haunted, hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. He didn't look like a man who was ready to fight. He looked like a man who had already won the only fight that mattered. High Matriarch Ilara stood at the base of the shuttle ramp. Beside her, Krell looked like a different species altogether without his armor. He was wearing a high-collared instructor's tunic, the insignia of the new academy pinned to his chest. "You have the reactors?" Ilara asked, her silver hair catching the morning light. "And the medical supplies," Jace confirmed, bowing his head. "Thank you, Matriarch. My people won't forget this." "It is a small price to pay for the return of our conscience," Ilara said, her ears angling in a gesture of sincere gratitude. "You have given us a future that doesn't require a graveyard to sustain it. That is a gift we can never truly repay." Jace turned to Krell. The giant was looking up at the sky, his hands clasped behind his back. "So, instructor," Jace said, "any final words for the suit rat?" Krell looked down at him, a glint of humor in his golden eyes. "Just one. Don't get lazy, Mercer. The galaxy is a big place, and most of it doesn't have a matriarch to keep the peace. There are still a lot of people out there who think a loud roar is the same thing as a good argument." "I'll keep my drone charged," Jace promised. He extended his hand. Krell looked at it for a second, then reached out and took it. The handshake was brief, but it carried the weight of a blood oath. They were no longer enemies, and they weren't quite friends. They were something more complicated. They were two men who had seen the worst of each other and decided that the best was worth fighting for. Jace turned and walked up the ramp. As the airlock hissed shut, he found himself in the small observation lounge at the rear of the shuttle. He watched through the reinforced glass as the magnetic clamps released and the shuttle began to rise. Ethelgard began to shrink, its jagged black towers disappearing into the haze of the volcanic crater. From this height, the city didn't look like a predator's skull. It looked like a heart, pulsing with the red heat of the planet, trying to find a rhythm that didn't involve the percussion of war. Jace sat in the pilot's chair, but he didn't engage the autopilot just yet. He wanted to feel the controls, the slight resistance of the thrusters, the subtle vibration of the ship responding to his touch. He moved the shuttle through the atmospheric stabilizers with a precision that didn't require the amplification of a suit. He was just a man moving a machine, and that was enough. As the shuttle broke through the upper atmosphere and entered the silent, star-strewn void of space, Jace leaned back and watched Karis V turn into a glowing orange marble behind him. "I spent 10 years of my life believing that my armor was the only thing keeping me alive. I thought that if I let the ghosts in, they would pull me apart, piece by piece. I thought that to be strong, I had to be a void, someone who could take the hits without feeling the impact. I was a professional at stepping aside, at disappearing into the math of the movement because I was too afraid to stand in the reality of the moment. But on Karis V, I realized that I was wrong. The armor wasn't protecting me, it was a prison. It was keeping the world out, but it was also keeping me in. I saw a man who had everything: strength beyond measure, glory beyond count, and an empire at his feet, and he was the emptiest person I had ever met. He was a killer because he didn't know how to be anything else. He was a hero because he was too terrified to be a human. We tell ourselves stories to make the dark feel less cold. We call our massacres victories and our prejudices doctrine. We build these massive gleaming towers of obsidian and we call it civilization, while we ignore the screaming coming from the habitation domes. We think that if we can just overpower the resistance, we'll finally find peace. But peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of discernment. It's the moment you realize that the person on the other side of the blade is just as afraid as you are. I'm going home now. I don't have a medal, and I don't have a parade waiting for me. I just have a cargo hold full of reactors and a head full of new memories. I'm still a soldier, and I suspect I'll still have to fight. But I won't be fighting to win anymore. I'll be fighting to protect the space where a better story can be told. I'll be fighting to make sure that the next time someone like Krell looks in a mirror, they don't have to look away. We spend so much of our lives sharpening our blades and reinforcing our walls, convinced that our survival depends on our ability to dominate the space around us. But have you ever stopped to wonder, if you finally achieved total victory and every threat was silenced, who would be left standing in the mirror? Would you recognize the person who did whatever it took to win? Or would you find that in the process of defeating your enemies, you accidentally destroyed the very thing you were trying to protect? Jace Mercer reached into his flight suit and pulled out a small silver coin, the traditional mark of a Valkyr traveler. He flipped it into the air, catching it with a practiced, easy motion before sliding it into the navigation console. The shuttle's ion drives flared into a brilliant, steady blue, and with a soft, final hum, Jace Mercer vanished into the stars, leaving the war behind and heading toward a sun that was finally starting to rise.